A homeless-looking street musician gets laughed at for playing Elton John. Then Elton John himself sits down next to him. Now, I need you to imagine this scene for a moment. It's a cool Saturday afternoon in London's Covent Garden, October 2017. The cobblestone streets are packed with tourists snapping selfies, couples window shopping, and commuters weaving through the crowd with their heads buried in their phones. And right there, tucked between a flower stand and an overpriced coffee shop, sits a man behind a battered upright piano that looks like it survived 2 world wars and a house fire. His name is David Southerton. He's 53 years old. His jacket is frayed at the elbows. His shoes have holes in them. His fingerless gloves are more hole than glove at this point. His beard is long and unkempt, streaked with gray, and his hair hasn't seen a proper barber in what looks like months. To the hundreds of people walking past him that afternoon, David looked like exactly what they assumed he was, just another struggling busker, another invisible face in the urban landscape, someone to walk past without making eye contact. But here's the thing about David Southerton that nobody on that street knew. This man could play the piano like his fingers were having a conversation with God. And what happened over the next 45 minutes would become one of the most legendary moments in modern music history. A moment that would rack up over 90 million views across social media, make grown adults weep at their desks, and remind the entire world that talent doesn't come with a dress code. If you're already hooked on this story, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a thumbs up on this video. It genuinely helps us keep bringing you these incredible stories, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Now, to really understand the magic of what happened that afternoon, you need to know who David Southerton actually was, and how he ended up playing a half-broken piano on a London street corner. David grew up in Nottingham, England, in a modest working-class family. His father drove delivery trucks. His mother worked part-time at a laundromat. They weren't poor, but they certainly weren't comfortable. Music wasn't part of their world. There was no piano in the house, no instruments of any kind, and definitely no money for music lessons. But when David was 7 years old, something happened that would change the entire trajectory of his life. His primary school received a donated upright piano. It was old, slightly out of tune, and missing one of its keys entirely. Most of the children ignored it after the first week of novelty wore off. But David couldn't stay away from it. Every lunch break, every free period, every moment he could steal, he would sit at that piano and just explore. His teacher, Mrs. Halloway, noticed almost immediately. She later told a local newspaper that she had never seen anything like it. Within weeks, David was picking out melodies by ear. Within months, he was playing full songs. He had no formal training, no sheet music, no YouTube tutorials, obviously. This was the late 1970s. He simply listened to songs on the radio and then sat down and figured out how to play them. By the time he was 12, David was playing at school assemblies, local church services, and community events. People in Nottingham started calling him the Little Maestro. His talent was extraordinary, the kind of natural gift that music teachers encounter maybe once in an entire career. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. At 15, David's father was injured in a workplace accident and couldn't drive anymore. The family's income plummeted. David dropped out of school to take odd jobs and help support his mother and 2 younger siblings. The piano became a luxury he couldn't afford, literally and figuratively. He worked in warehouses, construction sites, and kitchens, his gifted hands carrying boxes and washing dishes instead of dancing across ivory keys. For nearly 20 years, David barely touched a piano. He married young, had 2 children, and for a while things were okay. Not great, but okay. Then his marriage fell apart in his late 30s. A bitter divorce left him financially devastated. He lost his home. He bounced between friends' couches, temporary accommodations, and eventually found himself living in a series of hostels and shelters across England. It was during this lowest period of his life that David rediscovered the piano. A community center in South London had an old keyboard in the corner of their common room. One evening, feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his entire life, David sat down and placed his fingers on the keys, and something extraordinary happened. It all came back. Not just the muscle memory, but the feeling, the connection, the sense that when his hands were on a piano, nothing else in the world mattered. Not the cold hostels, not the empty pockets, not the ache of missing his children. For those moments, David was exactly where he was supposed to be. He started busking shortly after that. He found an old upright piano that someone was throwing away, and with the help of a friend who owned a van, positioned it in various spots around London. He played every day, rain or shine, earning just enough in tips to eat and maintain his modest accommodation in a shared housing facility. Most days people walked right past him, some dropped coins, a few stopped to listen, and every once in a while someone would stand there for an entire song and clap at the end. But far too often people were cruel. This is the part of the story that's hard to tell, but it's important because it makes what happened next mean so much more. Street buskers deal with a lot. Most people don't realize what it's like to pour your heart and soul into a performance while the vast majority of the world treats you like part of the furniture. But David experienced something worse than indifference. He experienced active mockery. Because of his appearance, his worn-out clothes, his unkempt beard, his general look of someone who had been chewed up and spit out by life, people would actually stop to make fun of him. Teenagers would film him on their phones, laughing and making comments about the homeless guy who thinks he's a pianist. Adults weren't much better. Some would make snide remarks as they walked past. Others would watch him play for a moment, and then loudly declare to their companions that he was terrible, often without actually listening for more than a few seconds. One incident that David later described in an interview hit him particularly hard. A well-dressed couple stopped in front of his piano one afternoon. The woman nudged her partner and said, loud enough for David and everyone nearby to hear, "Oh, look, another one who thinks he's Elton John." They both laughed and walked away. The thing is, at that very moment, David was actually playing an Elton John song. He was playing Your Song, one of the most beloved ballads in the history of popular music, and he was playing it beautifully. But they never stayed long enough to hear it. That's what hurt the most, David later said. Not the insults, but the fact that people made up their minds about him before he ever played a note. They saw his clothes, made their judgment, and that was it. The music never had a chance. On that particular Saturday afternoon in October 2017, the mockery was worse than usual. David had set up his piano in his regular spot in Covent Garden. The weather was decent enough to attract large crowds, which usually meant better tips. He started with some classical pieces, then moved into popular songs, and eventually settled into what had become his signature piece, Elton John's "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me." Now, if you've never heard this song, first of all, go listen to it immediately after this video. It's an absolute masterpiece. Written by Elton John and Bernie Taupin, released in 1974, it's one of those songs that starts quietly, almost tenderly, and then builds into this massive, soaring, emotionally devastating climax. It requires not just technical skill to play properly, but genuine emotional depth. You can't fake your way through that song. David started playing, and almost immediately, a group of young men standing nearby began laughing. One of them pointed at David and said something to his friends that made them all crack up. Another pulled out his phone to film, clearly intending to capture footage of what he assumed would be a laughable performance. An older woman walking past shook her head and muttered something about these people cluttering up the streets. A businessman in an expensive overcoat dropped his eyes to the ground and picked up his pace, as if even being near a street musician might somehow contaminate his afternoon. David kept playing. He had learned to block out the noise, to retreat into the music and let it carry him somewhere the cruelty couldn't reach. His fingers moved across the keys with a precision and tenderness that was completely at odds with his rough appearance. The opening notes of "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me" floated through the October air like something alive, weaving between the conversations and the footsteps and the traffic noise. And then something happened that would change David Southerton's life forever. About 2 minutes into David's performance, a figure appeared at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered. He was wearing a dark coat, a simple scarf, and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. He was shorter than you might expect, slightly round, and moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned long ago how to navigate crowds without being recognized. It was Elton John. Sir Elton Hercules John, to be precise. Knight of the British Empire, 5-time Grammy winner, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, seller of more than 300 million records worldwide, and the man who had written and originally performed the very song that David Southerton was currently pouring his heart into on a battered street piano. Now, what was Elton John doing in Covent Garden on a random Saturday afternoon? As it turned out, he had been shopping nearby with his husband, David Furnish. They were on their way to a late lunch when Elton heard something that stopped him dead in his tracks. He heard his own song, but it wasn't coming from a speaker or a radio. It was being played live, on a real piano, by someone who clearly understood every emotional nuance that Elton had poured into the composition over 4 decades earlier. Furnish later told an interviewer that Elton's face changed completely the moment he heard it. He went very quiet, Furnish said. He just turned toward the sound and started walking. I knew better than to say anything. When Elton hears something that moves him, you just let him go. Elton stood at the back of the small crowd for nearly a full minute, listening. He watched as a couple of teenagers continued to snicker and film. He watched as passersby hurried along without a second glance. He watched as this clearly talented man played one of his greatest compositions with the kind of emotional honesty that most professional musicians spend their entire careers trying to achieve. And then Elton John did something that nobody expected. He walked forward, excused himself past the small crowd, and sat down on the piano bench right next to David Southerton. David didn't notice at first. His eyes were closed, lost in the music, his fingers moving from memory and from somewhere deep inside his chest. It wasn't until he heard a second pair of hands join his on the keyboard, filling in the bass line with a touch that was unmistakably, impossibly familiar, that his eyes flew open. He turned to his left, and there, sitting 6 inches away from him on a rickety piano bench in the middle of Covent Garden, was Elton John. David's hands froze, his mouth fell open, his eyes went wide. Elton looked at him with a warm, gentle smile and said 5 words that David Southerton would remember for the rest of his life. Don't stop now, it's beautiful. What happened next has been described by people who were there as one of the most magical musical moments they had ever witnessed. David, trembling visibly, placed his fingers back on the keys. Elton nodded encouragingly and began to play alongside him. 2 pairs of hands on one old piano, one pair belonging to a street busker in fingerless gloves, the other belonging to one of the greatest musicians who has ever lived. They played Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, together from the second verse all the way through to the end. The teenagers who had been laughing fell completely silent. The phones that had been recording mockingly were now recording something entirely different. The businessman in the expensive overcoat had stopped walking and turned around. The woman who had muttered about cluttering the streets was standing still with her hand over her mouth. Within moments, the small crowd of a dozen people became 50, then 100, then more than 200. People were streaming in from neighboring streets, drawn by the sound and by the growing murmur of voices saying, Is that Elton John? When they reached the final chorus, Elton began to sing. That unmistakable voice, weathered by decades but no less powerful, filled the Covent Garden air. And then David, who hadn't sung in public in years, found his own voice rising alongside it. By the time the final notes faded, half the crowd was in tears. There was a moment of absolute silence, the kind of silence that only happens when something genuinely transcendent has occurred, and then the entire crowd erupted. The applause was thunderous. People were cheering, crying, hugging strangers. The teenagers who had been mocking David minutes earlier were clapping harder than anyone. But the most powerful moment wasn't the performance itself. It was what happened immediately after. Elton turned to David on that piano bench and extended his hand. What's your name, mate? David, he managed. David Southerton. David, Elton said, looking him directly in the eye. You play that song better than I do. David broke down. Right there on a piano bench in Covent Garden, this 53-year-old man who had been mocked and dismissed and made invisible by the world, wept openly while Elton John put his arm around his shoulder. And then Elton did something that went far beyond a kind gesture. He stood up, turned to the crowd, and spoke. This man, he said, pointing to David, is a brilliant pianist, and every single one of you who walked past him today without stopping to listen missed something extraordinary. Don't ever judge a musician by their appearance. Don't ever judge anyone by their appearance. The most beautiful music I've ever heard has come from people the world tried to forget. The crowd was completely silent. Elton reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to David. Call this number on Monday, he said. We're going to have a proper conversation about your future. Now, many stories like this end right there, with the dramatic moment, the viral video, the feel-good ending. But what makes David Southerton's story truly extraordinary is what happened in the weeks and months that followed. David did call that number on Monday. It connected him with Elton's management team, who arranged a meeting. Within 2 weeks, David was in a professional recording studio for the first time in his life, laying down tracks with session musicians who were stunned by his ability. Elton personally funded David's first studio sessions and connected him with producers. He didn't just give David a handout. He gave him the opportunity he had never been given, the chance to be heard properly. The video of their duet, filmed on over 30 different phones that afternoon, went viral almost immediately. Within a week, it had been viewed over 20 million times. Within a month, that number had more than quadrupled. News outlets around the world picked up the story. David appeared on morning television shows, radio programs, and podcasts. People who had walked past him for years suddenly wanted to hear his story. But David handled his sudden fame with remarkable humility. In every interview, he made the same point. "There are thousands of musicians out there just like me," he would say. "People with real talent who never get a chance because the world decides they don't look the part. Elton didn't just change my life that day. He reminded everyone that music doesn't care what you're wearing." David released his first album the following year. It wasn't a massive commercial hit, but it received genuine critical acclaim and sold respectably. More importantly, it gave him a stable income for the first time in over a decade. He reconnected with his children. He moved into his own flat. He started teaching piano to disadvantaged young people in South London, determined to make sure that no talented kid ever felt as invisible as he had. Elton John attended one of David's small concert performances about 6 months after their famous encounter. He sat in the front row, applauded enthusiastically, and afterward told reporters, "I didn't discover David Southerton. He was always there. The world just wasn't paying attention." There's a reason this story resonated with so many millions of people, and it goes far beyond the celebrity surprise element. It goes far beyond the feel-good factor of a famous musician being kind. This story hits so hard because every single one of us has been David Southerton at some point in our lives. Maybe not literally sitting behind a piano being laughed at, but we've all had moments where we were judged before we were heard. We've all been in situations where someone looked at our clothes, our accent, our background, our age, and decided they already knew everything they needed to know about us. And we've also all been the people walking past. We've all made snap judgments. We've all looked at someone and made assumptions about their worth based on what we could see on the surface, never stopping to wonder what extraordinary things might be living beneath that surface. That's the real magic of what happened in Covent Garden that afternoon. It wasn't just that a famous person was kind to a stranger. It was that the entire dynamic of judgment was flipped upside down in the space of a single song. The people who were laughing were suddenly crying. The people who were dismissing were suddenly applauding. The person who was invisible became the center of the universe. And the catalyst for all of it was one man who bothered to stop and listen. Elton John didn't walk past. He didn't check his phone. He didn't make a judgment based on what David looked like. He heard the music, recognized the talent, and responded to it with the generosity and humanity that defines the very best of what human beings can be. David Southerton still plays piano. He still busks occasionally in Covent Garden, though these days, people tend to stop and listen. He says he does it not because he needs the money anymore, but because he never wants to forget where he came from. And because you never know, he says with a smile, who might sit down next to you. This story reminds us of something we already know but so easily forget. That the most extraordinary things in this world are often hidden in the most ordinary-looking packages. That talent, beauty, and brilliance don't announce themselves with designer labels and luxury accessories. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for another human being is simply to stop, to listen, and to say, "Don't stop. It's beautiful." If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you to look a little more carefully at the people around you, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this one, and leave a comment below telling me, have you ever been judged unfairly before people gave you a chance? Or have you ever been surprised by someone you almost overlooked? I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to hear your story. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, And remember, you never know who's sitting behind that piano.